Helpful watercolor tips and tricks. Lesson 3. Painting water drops with watercolors. Step-by-step tutorial for you to try. I will be showing you how to paint water drops on rose petals. You can follow this tutorial and also paint rose petals, or you can do it just on a plain surface, just watercolor layer applied on a paper, and that's it. Here I'm removing the excess amount of graphite from my paper so that my line drawing is clean and neat. Mixing watercolors for rose petals, adding water to my color palette, taking Sennelier Red, Indian Yellow to make it more warmer, more peachy color, and Permanent Rose. This is the main color for these rose petals, testing on a piece of paper, checking if everything is correct. I'm not here too concentrated on the color or on the form or anything. I will be painting, but the most thing that I will be concentrating is water drops. Here's Permanent Rose with Perylene Violet and adding a little bit of Indian Yellow for the shadow parts of these rose petals. Checking again on a piece of paper. And the third mix, Manganese Violet, Indian Yellow on a side of your color palette. We'll start with the first petal that I have on my paper. Applying clean water. Be sure that after mixing watercolors you have a clean water in your water glass. With a round synthetic brush I'm applying water layer on the whole petal, even those areas where will be water drops. Starting with main color of Sennelier Red, Permanent Rose and Indian Yellow, I'm applying watercolor layer, very transparent, very lightly, starting from the shadow part, from the darker part of these petals. Reference is available, you can open it right beside your tutorial and follow along. While the surface is wet, I'm slowly moving my watercolor layer towards the outer edge line. More watercolors on the darker side, which is on the right. We can check it in a reference. Please follow along too and watch the reference. Don't just paint along without thinking what are you doing if you want to paint these rose petals as well. Leaving the little tip of the bottom part unpainted, pushing watercolors towards the middle part, and now carefully apply even more watercolor layer to the shadow part and around those outlines of the water drops. With a clean and dry brush I can wipe out some pigment from the lightest parts, which is more on the right side in the middle, and of course inside the water drops. While the surface is wet with synthetic brush, it is very easy to remove some pigment from the paper. I'm not using any masking fluid to cover those water drop areas, or I will not be using any white color for those water drops. Everything is about the paper. Paper is the whitest white. In watercolors, nothing can be lighter than the paper. With a fine tip brush, I'm adding more watercolor layer to the shadow parts. Some edge lines, which we see in the reference, are very crisp and much darker than the main petal. First, I'm building the background for water drops where we will apply them. First, I'm painting the petal, and then I will slowly start to paint also water drops as I go. But first we need to apply some background color, because even behind, under those water drops, we see the color. Again, with clean and dry brush, I'm smoothing the lightest parts so that my transition from the shadow to the lightest part is smooth and gradual. With a finer tip brush, I'm adding more watercolors to the shadow area. Constantly comparing to my reference, noticing some new details, especially about the shadow area where I need to add more watercolors. Doing it gradually, transparently, moving forward slowly. Not applying very dark and saturated watercolor layers. The key to get a realistic watercolor painting is about layering and thinking about tonal values, constantly comparing to your reference. Reference has everything you need to know about your painting. Now I'm taking a very small amount on the tip of the brush of Indian yellow and adding little brush strokes to the very bottom part of that tip. Permanent rose for the lightest parts. We can see in the reference that in the lightest parts there is cooler pigment, which is pink in this case, and everything that is halftone and shadow area is much warmer, darker. That's how we also help to understand what is in the light, what is in the shadow. If the lightest part would be warm, then the shadow would be cool. But now we have cool lights, warm shadows. Manganese violet with permanent rose makes a nice, cool color mix. While the surface is resting for the first petal, we need to give the paper the rest to receive another layer of watercolors. Let's proceed to the second petal. In this tutorial, I will be painting 2 petals, and the third one is on you. Again, the technique is the same as we did for the first one. Applying watercolor starting from the shadow. We need a very nice background color for this petal to start painting water drops. Take a careful observation of each petal. Don't assume that petals are from one row, so they must be the same. No, they are curved differently, slightly bended or curved in different directions, and the shadow and light is hitting the surface differently. That's why we need to really think, how are we painting? How does it look? Where are the shadows? Where are the lightest parts? Again, with clean and dry brush, I'm removing watercolor layer from the water drop while the surface is still wet, moist. It's not wet, it's a little bit moist. If I will lift up my paper, nothing will drop or flow from the petal surface. Now I waited a little while that my surface is completely dry. Be careful, it really needs to be dry. And with an eraser, I'm removing graphite marks that are still visible, especially around those water drops and around outer edge lines. To make watercolor painting clean and neat, no graphite marks should be left, but be careful, the surface must be completely dry. And after removing graphite marks, I'm loading my finest tip brush with a mix of permanent rose with Perylene Violet and a little touch of Sennelier Red mix. And with the very tip of the brush, I'm applying shadow of the water drops. Look at the reference, really zoom in the reference and see how the shadow is behind the water drop. I apply a little line, then with clean and dry brush, I smooth the applied line layer so the transition from the shadow to the light is gradual. Repeating the same to the second. And also take a look of the shadow area of each water drop. As water drops form, they are in different shape and form. It means that also the shadow will be slightly maybe different, maybe a little bit turned or longer. It depends how tall or big water drop is. To make a realistic looking water drop, they shouldn't be identically the same. If on one petal we have 3 water drops, they must be different, and we see that in the reference. Take a really careful observation, zoom in, and you will notice that those water drops are very different. I'm now recording a little bit closer for you to see how I will mark those little shiny spots on the left side of the water drop. This is where we maybe think that some kind of white pigment is necessary or we need to use masking fluid. No, everything is achievable with the tip of your finest brush. Be very careful here. Observe how those light spots are placed on the water drop, and you can mark them with the tip of your brush. No need for white pigment, no need for masking fluid. Everything can be done with your finest brush. I marked those spots, colored around darker color mix of permanent rose with Perylene Violet. And now with clean and dry brush, I smooth the applied layer. So I have gradual transitions from the shadow to the lightest part. As you can see in the reference, there is the shadow area inside the water drop, and then it gradually becomes lighter. Doing the same with the second water drop, there are slightly different marks of those bright white spots. Take a closer look, and doing exactly the same. For the third one, I will be placing only one bright spot, and that water drop is much lighter than the 2 above because this water drop is more exposed to light. Later I will add more layers for the shadow area for the upper water drops, but this one will stay much lighter. So also I have a difference with the shadow strength for the water drops. Everything is important if you want to get a realistic looking painting and water drops. Now to the second petal. We have only one big water drop. Again, with the tip of the brush, I'm marking those white spots and carefully coloring, painting around those spots the shadow part of the inner part of the water drop. Now that my surface is dry, I can continue to apply watercolor layer, transparent watercolor layer, to my rose petal. To make it more saturated, more darker in the shadow area, add more gradual transitions from the shadow to the lightest part, building volume, building realistic look of these beautiful rose petals. Mostly painting on the shadow area because it's more important to build more layers for the shadow area. We will get to the lightest parts. It's much easier with the lightest parts. It's better to leave lighter till the end and then add some watery layer of plain pigment to the lightest parts, rather than really think of those light areas, and then you will finish with a much darker subject, more looking flat. It's important to leave the lightest parts light as much as possible. In the beginning, I leave much wider space for the lightest parts because I know that after many layers, my lightest area will become smaller and smaller. But if I will leave in the beginning the same amount of light area as it looks in the reference, then I will finish with a very dark subject. That's how it works, because with layers we tend to go a little bit further in the light, a little bit more, and then we at the end take a look and where is my light area? It's gone. It's all about leaving in the first layers much wider area for the light area. If you are using too much water for painting, be sure that you give paper a rest and wait between layers for the paper to get dry. I am not using too much water. Really small amount of water is on my brush and on my color palette. That's why I can add 1 and 2 layers and then I give it a rest. Here I'm going over lightest part with a very transparent amount of Sennelier Red and Permanent Rose to give more color, more layer to the lightest part. It's not so bright and light how it looks at this point. That's why I'm adding 1 layer, very transparent. After drying it will become lighter because paper is absorbing pigment, but I'm getting more closer to the rose petal reference color. Taking clean Permanent Rose and adding to the lightest part. Applying watercolor layer and smoothing the applied layer. Again, leaving the first petal to dry and moving on to the second petal. Applying with the round synthetic brush mix of permanent rose and Perylene Violet, adding a little bit of Sennelier, and starting from the shadow area. Here the shadow area is slightly different than on the first petal. Look at the reference and follow what you see. I'm loading my brush with very small amount of Indian yellow and applying Indian yellow to the shadow area of the petals. Yellow pigment gives warmth to the shadow area and to the halftones. I need to make contrast between light and dark, also with the temperature of the pigments. First petal is dry. I can move on with the next layer. With the finest brush, mix of Perylene Violet and Permanent Rose and a little amount of Sennelier Red added to this watercolor mix, I'm adding more shadow layer to the shadow area on the right, and with the very tip of the brush I'm outlining the very bottom part. You can see in the reference that there is a very crisp and dark edge. When the rose starts to fade away, the edges of rose become much darker and looking more crisper. As we applied more darker layers to the rose petal, the shadow of water drops became much lighter. This is the contrast. When we have a light surrounding, the first layer looks very dark and saturated, but as we started to add more layers to rose petal, shadow of water drop become much lighter. I'm adding Perylene Violet with Permanent Rose to the shadow part of each water drop, slightly making it more darker and more contrasty. Also adding a little bit darker area in the inner part shadow area of the water drop. Carefully, don't overpaint those beautiful white spots that you carefully painted with the tip of the brush. We will need those little spots as they are, completely light. Doing the same for the second petals water drop. Adding a very pale and transparent amount of Sennelier Red with Permanent Rose to inner part of the water drop, leaving very small area on the right side. We see in the reference that the water drop inside is not completely light and bright. It has also its background color. More to the shadow parts, adding another layer with watercolors to the shadow area. Building that rose petal around those water drops carefully, not to overpaint. Slowly, with the very tip of the brush, you are in control of your brush strokes, where the watercolors go. As you can see, water amount is very small. I'm very in control of my watercolor layer appliance and how I'm moving and pushing brush strokes and watercolors are there where I apply them. They're not flowing away somewhere around the rose petal. It's more pigment rather than water on my watercolor brush. Adding more layers to the second petal. Another layer of watercolors to the shadow part of the rose petal. Be careful not to paint with very dark and saturated watercolor mixes, especially if you are using Perylene Violet the same as I do. It's very nice and so helpful pigment, but also very dangerous when you are using it too dark, too saturated. You will finish with very muddy and flat looking subject. I still constantly looking at reference and noticing that my shadow part is not as dark and contrasty as it is in the reference. And in the reference, I like the contrast of light and shadow and how those water drops are placed. So I need to work more on the background color for the rose petal. Careful around those water drops. At this point, those water drops are a little bit too bright and too light, but that is better to have something very light in the watercolor painting, because you can always go darker. It is harder if you notice that, oh my god, it's really dark and there's almost nothing can be done when you have a very dark and muddy looking painting. Adding more contrast and darkness inside the water drops with the very tip of the brush. making these water drops a little bit darker, very transparently and carefully. Better to go gradually to darkness rather quickly and saturated. Remember that we can always go darker. It's harder to go lighter. So paint patiently, slowly, gradually, transparently. It doesn't matter if even the subject is very dark and saturated. It's all about layers. How many layers do you apply? Making slightly darker water drop on the second petal. Applying watercolor layer and smoothing with clean and dry brush. With round synthetic brush and watery wash of Sennelier Red and Permanent Rose, I'm going over with a smoother watery wash over the whole petals. Adding extra layer, slightly smoothing the layers underneath, making this rose petal more smoother, more velvety looking. Adding Permanent Rose to the lightest area. And also slightly adding to water drops. We can see inside the water drops there is also some notions of pink color. That's what we are noticing when we are looking in reference. The more we look, the more we start to notice. That's how our eyesight works. In the beginning, it's see generally how does everything look, color, but the more we start to explore and look carefully, observe the reference, the more we start to notice color tones, color values, details. Everything is important to get a realistic looking painting. I'm constantly looking at reference. Adding Perylene Violet and Permanent Rose to my color palette, and with the synthetic brush, round synthetic brush, I'm applying more to the shadow area, building more contrast. I still see that I need to build this contrast between shadow and lightest parts, and I'm gradually going to that more contrasty look. Apply watercolor layer and smooth with a clean and dry brush. Taking with the finest brush manganese violet with permanent rose mix and adding on the bottom part between very bright and saturated red pinkish color looking rose petal and the very tip of the bottom part, which is completely white, almost white. There are also some little shadow area. Adding more Indian yellow. Adding a little bit of manganese violet mix. It will make a beautiful shadow area for this yellow part. And very, very carefully observe what you see in the reference, painting with the very tip of the brush. I'm adding clear Sennelier Red to my color palette and transparent amount applying to the areas around the water drops. We can see in reference that there's some glow coming from water drops, not completely dark, but the water is reflecting some color which is on the surface, in this case rose petals. With the round synthetic brush, another layer of watery Sennelier Red and Permanent Rose for smoothness and more richness for these rose petals. Adding Perylene Violet to my color palette. With the very tip of the brush, I'm more painting more contrasty shadow area behind the water drop and inside the water drop. The very close to the very edge of the water drop. It is important to make the edges of the water drops really crisp and neat. They shouldn't be fluffy from watercolors as they float around. You need to make crisp edges of these water drops. Adding Sennelier Red inside the water drop and leaving the bottom right part still much lighter. adding finishing touches to water drops and rose petals, and finishing this lesson about water drops. Hope you learned something new and really enjoyed painting these beautiful water drops, which look very roundish and popping up from the surface. It's all about careful observation of your reference, control of your brush strokes, and painting transparently and patiently. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this tutorial. See you in my next tutorials. Bye bye.